Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into something calm, earthy, and honestly kind of adorable if you squint hard enough. So get comfortable. Dim whatever lights are still fighting for your attention. Let your shoulders melt somewhere between your mattress and whatever minor life regrets you've got on rotation. Because tonight, we're beginning a slow walk, more like a gentle shuffle, into the peaceful, rhythmic world of Aztec floating garden keepers. A place where crops grew on mud rafts, farmers drifted around like sleepy swans, and daily labor moved with the vibe of improvised choreography. Nothing dramatic, nothing chaotic, just the quiet elegance of people who were way better at gardening than most of us will ever be. So, whenever you're ready, let's float into it. The Valley of Mexico, long before traffic, concrete, and the existential dread of modern life, was a place defined by water. Not the relaxing oceanfront kind with overpriced resorts, but a shimmering, lake-filled basin where the Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica, crafted one of the most peculiar and strangely beautiful agricultural systems the world has ever seen. These were the chinampas, often described, a little inaccurately, as floating gardens. They didn't actually float. But honestly, strategically stabilized mud rectangles anchored by willow trees doesn't have the same sleepy charm, so we'll stick with the classic phrase. Picture this: long, neat parcels of land woven into the shallows of Lake Xochimilco and Lake Chalco. Each chinampa was like a polite little island, held together by reeds, roots, and sheer farming stubbornness. Rows of willows stood at the edges, their roots digging into the underwater sediments like nature's version of rebar. And between these green ribbons of farmland were canals, soft, narrow waterways that reflected the sky like a calm, accidental mirror. The whole system looked like someone had tried to organize nature using nothing but a ruler, a vague sense of hope, and a need for fresh tomatoes. Now, the people who maintained these gardens were not warriors, priests, or dramatic political schemers. They were farmers. Gardeners, really. Soft-spoken, sun-worn, and probably tired in that existential, quiet way every gardener is. But they handled their carefully balanced world with a kind of casual precision that sometimes looked suspiciously like choreography. Not intentional choreography. Nobody in Tenochtitlan was setting up dance rehearsals for vegetable maintenance. But when you watched the gliding canoes, the rhythmic farming gestures, the way workers moved in tidy patterns along rows of maize and beans, it kind of felt like a slow-motion waltz. Each gardener began earlier than reasonable humans should. The pre-dawn air was cold enough to make you question life choices, but it also wrapped the chinampas in a soft blue haze. The birds would start first, then the insects, then the soft, wooden clunk of a canoe being pushed off from shore. These boats weren't flashy. They were long, narrow, and just sturdy enough not to tip over the moment someone sneezed. They glided silently between the rows of chinampas, the water only disturbed by the occasional frog hopping away with the speed of someone who didn't pay rent but still took personal offense at being approached. Inside these canoes, the keepers crouched, stood, shifted, and leaned with an ease born of lifelong muscle memory. Every movement had a purpose, but none had urgency. This wasn't the battlefield. This wasn't even the marketplace. This was a place where lettuce grew at its own pace and nobody tried to rush it. A keeper might spend an entire morning doing what modern urbanites would call gentle tasks, or slow living, or the kind of thing influencers post about before returning to their actual chaotic lives. They scooped up soft lake mud, cieno, from the bottom with long wooden poles, lifting it into their canoes with easy, practiced motions. The mud smelled earthy, wet, and perfectly alive, which is to say it smelled nothing like the artificially scented soil in brightly lit hardware stores. This mud was essential. It replenished the chinampas. Every scoop, lifted with a small splash, settled into the boats with a sound halfway between a thud and a sigh. Then the keepers paddled back to shore, spreading the mud along the gardens to keep them fertile. There was a rhythm to it, a gentle back and forth across the canal. A slow lifting, a careful placement. If someone set this to music, it'd just be a soft drumbeat and maybe a flute that's slightly out of tune. Let's drift over to another small moment: weeding. Modern people tend to assume weeds grow out of spite. Aztec gardeners probably thought the same, but they dealt with them with serene resignation. They plucked weeds calmly and methodically, tossing them into the canal where they decompose and eventually become more mud, an endless cycle of plants quitting their job only to be rehired as fertilizer. And then there were the planting rituals. Not dramatic ceremonies, just daily routines that still had a touch of quiet reverence. Seeds were pressed gently into long, straight rows. The keeper's hands moved in neat patterns, fingers smoothing the soil like they were tucking the plants into bed. There was a subtle aesthetic to it. Lines had to be straight. Spacing had to be even. Nature was being politely asked to behave itself. Sometimes, a keeper might hum, not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft little tune to keep pace with the work. After all, if you're spending your morning placing baby squash plants into damp earth while gliding around a lake, you might as well commit to the meditative vibe. Every so often, another canoe would drift by. The keepers exchanged greetings that were more like murmurs than conversations. "Good water today." Yes. "That heron is watching me again." They always do. It was workplace banter, but the sleepy version. Even when tasks overlapped, say, two keepers moving in opposite directions down the same canal, they navigated around each other with the awkward politeness of two people trying to pass in a narrow hallway. A gentle shift here, a small adjustment there, a tilt of the pole, a mutual, "Yeah, you go first, no, you go first, okay fine, we're both going." The whole thing had a slow, gentle flow, like stones worn smooth by water. But underneath this calm routine was a clever agricultural system that fed an entire empire. The chinampas were so productive, so ridiculously fertile, that they could yield crops year-round. Historians estimate they may have provided up to half of Tenochtitlan's food. So while the keepers looked peaceful, they were quietly supporting one of the most sophisticated urban centers in pre-Columbian America. You wouldn't think that, watching a man gently prune a chili plant while a turtle swims by like it owns the place. But yes, this sleepy scene was economic infrastructure. Let's glide over to another part of the day, tending the willows. These trees line the edges of each chinampa like polite guardians wearing leafy hats. They prevented erosion, kept the soil in place, and strutted around looking important despite having no idea how essential they were. Every few weeks, a keeper trimmed the branches, not aggressively, just enough to keep the tree from trying to take over the entire neighborhood. The trimmings were used for fencing, repairs, and sometimes for tying together new chinampas like nature's version of zip ties. Again, the movements involved here were slow, measured, nothing that would raise a heart rate. Perfect bedtime material. Now, let's drift into something more personal about the keepers themselves. These weren't elite nobles or people with fancy feathered headdresses that screamed, "I own more cacao than you." Chinampa keepers were usually from farming families, inheriting their plots and their routines like some people inherit questionable casserole recipes. Their days were long but not frantic. They worked with the steady patience of people who understood that plants will grow exactly as fast as they want and no faster. And yes, if you're wondering, they did occasionally grumble about things. Because humans have been complaining about work since the dawn of time. Maybe the maize didn't sprout evenly. Maybe a coworker borrowed their prized digging stick and returned it with mysterious dents. Maybe a canoe got stuck on a shallow patch again, because apparently the lake enjoyed reminding people who was truly in control. But the frustration never escalated. There were no dramatic outbursts, no yelling, no storming off into the reeds like a reality TV contestant. Just a long sigh, a resigned shrug, and a quiet return to planting beans. Around midday, there was a pause, nothing structured, just a moment when the sun rose high enough that even the hardest working gardener admitted defeat and took a seat in the canoe. Lunch was simple, usually tortillas, some beans, maybe a handful of chili peppers to jolt the senses back into consciousness. But eaten on the chinampa, with the water reflecting soft ripples onto the undersides of the willow branches, even basic food had a sense of deep calm. Sometimes dragonflies hovered nearby, doing their little acrobatic routines. Herons picked at the shorelines, judging everyone with the confidence of birds who know they look sleek in photos. And the keeper would just sit there, breathing, watching, letting the day settle around them. There was no rush to resume work, just a slow easing back into movement, like someone stretching after a long nap. Throughout the afternoon, the canals grew quieter. The breeze picked up slightly, and the gardeners continued their slow, mirrored routines across the water. In all of this, there was an elegance, not intentional but natural. A choreography not set to music, but to the steady rhythm of a world built around water, mud, roots, and the patient art of growing food. The unexpected choreography of the chinampa keepers wasn't about performance. It wasn't for show. It was simply the result of people living in harmony with a landscape they understood intimately, moving slowly through tasks they repeated so often they became instinctive. A life of quiet gestures, of gliding canoes, of soft voices drifting across the lake. And as the sun dipped lower, the air grew cooler, and the keepers finished their last rounds of watering and pruning, the gardens settled into evening with the calm certainty of a world that knew how to take care of itself. Chapter 2: The Unexpected Choreography of Aztec Floating Garden Keepers, Part 2. The evening hours on the chinampas didn't arrive with any fanfare. No triumphant sunsets bursting with dramatic color, no grand announcements from the heavens. Just a gradual softening of the light, the sky taking on a quieter version of itself, and the keepers shifting into the last stretch of their day with the subtle resignation of people who have accepted that yes, the squash plants will always need one more thing. As the sun settled behind the mountains, the shadows lengthened across the canals, turning the water from shimmering blue to a dark, reflective sheet that looked a little like obsidian having a peaceful moment. The keepers didn't rush. They weren't trying to beat the clock. Time moved at whatever pace felt convenient, which in this place was slow with a side of slower. One of the last tasks of the day was checking the moisture of the soil. Not by fancy instruments, just fingers pressing into the earth, feeling for softness, dampness, and that peculiar texture that farmers seem genetically wired to understand. A little too dry, and they'd scoop water from the canals with gourds or clay ladles, sprinkling it gently over crops in arcs that looked like small, sleepy rainbows. A little too wet, and they'd just shrug at the lake. The lake tended to do whatever it wanted. Negotiating with it wasn't really an option. Some keepers took this time to make sure the young plants, especially maize and amaranth, were standing upright. If a stalk leaned too far like a dramatic actor fainting in slow motion, the gardener would pack fresh mud around its base, firming it in place with the soft, patient pressure of hands that had spent a lifetime doing exactly this. There was a quiet pride in these small gestures. Not loud pride. More like the kind someone feels when they finally fix a wobbly table leg or realign the picture frame that's been crooked for 3 months. A little internal nod. That's better. Across the water, you could hear other keepers finishing up as well. Soft thumps of tools being put away, the tiny splash of a paddle dipping into the canal, the occasional rustle of crops brushing against someone's clothing as they walked the narrow embankments. And sometimes, just sometimes, there would be the faintest sound of conversation drifting across the chinampas, not full discussions, just short statements that didn't require full sentences. Beans look good. This heron's been following me. They're nosy birds. It was the agricultural equivalent of office small talk. Gentle, functional, and requiring absolutely no emotional investment. Let's glide a bit deeper into the landscape itself, because the chinampas were more than farmland. They were ecosystems, quiet, self-sustaining, and designed with a kind of practicality that feels almost too sensible for human beings. Between the rows of crops, insects hummed. Dragonflies hovered with the precision of tiny, iridescent helicopters. Frogs croaked with the confidence of creatures who fully believed they owned the place. Even the occasional fish swam near the edges of the canals, darting between submerged roots like they were auditioning for some underwater ballet. The keepers knew these creatures well. Most of them weren't pests, they were part of the cycle. Ducks might nibble at insects. Fish helped keep the waters from clogging with algae. Even the herons, those tall, elegant professionals of bird judgment, played their part by trimming the frog population just enough to keep things balanced. It was a stable system, not because anyone micromanaged it, but because the gardeners understood, deep in their bones, that interfering too much never ended well. Nature was best guided, not controlled. So they worked around the rhythms of the lake, adjusting quietly whenever something shifted. One of the most surprisingly calm rituals of chinampa life involved raising seedlings. Instead of planting everything directly in the soil, the keepers began many crops in small seedbeds made from lake mud mixed with decayed vegetation. The result was a soft, rich mixture, dark, damp, and full of nutrients. Seeds were pressed gently into these mini-beds, which were shaped into tiny cubes or rectangles called chipines. The gardeners stacked them in neat rows, like the world's sleepiest version of building blocks. These mud beds were carried from canoe to chinampa with a level of care usually reserved for holding a sleepy cat. Placing the seedlings into the chinampa soil later was another slow, careful task. Each chapin was lowered into the earth with smooth, circular motions, hands pressing, smoothing, tucking. It was almost comically gentle, especially for people living in a society that was, in most other aspects, very much not gentle. But here, on the chinampas, the pace slowed. The gestures softened. The world became quietly coordinated. There's something almost hypnotic about imagining a keeper performing these tasks in the fading light. The air cooling, the lake settling, the crops standing in orderly rows, and the gardener leaning over the soil, hands dark with earth, moving with that half-conscious flow people slip into when performing familiar and comforting tasks. Let's drift over to another aspect of their rhythm, maintaining the canals. Over time, plants, algae, and silt started creeping into the waterways. Not dramatically, just enough to require occasional attention. A keeper might spend part of the afternoon clearing out reeds with a wooden rake, gathering them in bundles that could be used later for thatching roofs or reinforcing the edges of a chinampa. He'd scoop out clumps of moss with a long-handled net, lifting them up with the slow, measured pace of someone retrieving something fragile. The removed vegetation wasn't wasted. It went back into compost piles, which eventually became the rich, dark mud used for raising new crops. Nothing was wasted. Everything fed something else. The whole system felt designed by a group that collectively decided, let's avoid chaos if at all possible. As the evening deepened, the smell of wet earth mixed with the scent of crushed leaves and the faint sweetness of flowering plants. There were marigolds around some chinampas, bright citrus-colored blooms planted not for aesthetics, but to deter pests. Still, they added a splash of color to the greens and browns of the gardens, catching the last golden rays of the sun in a gentle glow. Around this time, a keeper might pause to watch the light shift. Not intentionally, not romantically, just because humans tend to stare at sunsets whether they plan to or not. There was something quietly satisfying about seeing the sky dim into soft purples while tiny ripples moved across the water. Now and then, the willows creaked in the wind, their long branches swaying with a kind of unbothered laziness. The keepers tied some branches back, reinforced others, and occasionally cut off those that grew too wild. It wasn't pruning for beauty. It was just logical maintenance, keeping things sturdy, balanced, and unlikely to collapse into the canal during the next storm. The keepers rarely worked entirely alone, either. Families tended chinampas together. Older parents moved slowly along the edges, checking crops with the practiced eyes of people who had spent decades reading soil like a book. Younger workers paddled the canoes, their movements a little more energetic, though still muted by the tranquility of the environment. Children sometimes helped by carrying tools or holding baskets. Their tasks were tiny, their attention span even tinier. Some probably spent more time watching turtles than actually helping, but that's been the fate of children on farms everywhere for all of human history. Let's wander gently into another detail, the harvest. Harvesting on the chinampas wasn't a frenetic rush. It happened in waves, each plant ripening at its own pace. Corn stalks were cut with slow, sweeping motions. Beans were pulled by hand, gathered in small piles before being transferred to baskets. Squash was lifted carefully, turned over in hands, and checked for ripeness with a light tap. Every movement was deliberate, but never strained. The keepers harvested with the relaxed confidence of people who trusted their land. When the baskets were full, they loaded them into canoes, which sat low in the water under the weight but glided just as smoothly as ever. On the way to shore, the harvest created a soft, earthy scent that mixed with the lake air, a smell that was both familiar and satisfying, subtle, but layered with the promise of meals and markets and trade. And yes, even here, there was a kind of choreography. A keeper leaned forward to adjust the load. Another used a pole to guide the canoe along its route. A third might pass by in the opposite direction, exchanging a small nod, the farming version of a wave. In the markets of Tenochtitlan, these harvested goods would end up in orderly piles, sold to cooks, laborers, families, and even the palace's own stewards. But that part of the story lived outside the chinampas. Out here, the world remained slow, grounded, and measured. As twilight stretched across the valley, bats began swooping overhead, catching insects with the sort of precision that made humans look like clumsy amateurs by comparison. The keepers gathered the last few tools, placing them into canoes or storing them under small shelters. Canoes were tied to stakes along the edges, gently rocking with the movement of the water. And then, the day was done. Not finished. Not triumphantly concluded. Just done. The keepers walked along narrow paths between chinampas, stepping carefully so they didn't slide into the water, a mistake everyone made at least once, though nobody liked talking about it. In the dimming light, they headed home in small groups or alone, their silhouettes blending into the dark shapes of willow trunks and distant reeds. Chapter 3: The Unexpected Choreography of Aztec Floating Garden Keepers, Part 3. Night on the chinampas didn't fall abruptly. It seeped in, sliding gently over the water and settling into the crevices of the gardens with a slow certainty, like a soft blanket someone kept pulling higher and higher until the landscape finally gave up and went to sleep. But life didn't fully stop. The keepers had nighttime routines too, subtle actions, calm adjustments, and small gestures meant to prepare the floating plots for another day. Some gardeners liked to return just after dusk. Not for heavy work. Those tasks belonged to the sunlit hours, but for checking on the water levels. The lakes of the Valley of Mexico weren't always predictable. A breeze could shift them. A distant rainstorm could swell them. Even the moon's quiet influence could cause slight rises and falls that needed watching. So, in the fading light, a keeper would sometimes glide out again in a canoe, the paddle dipping softly, making small concentric ripples that faded almost instantly. The water grew darker by the minute, but the keepers knew the canals well enough to navigate without hesitation. They checked each chinampa's edges, feeling the soil borders with their poles, testing the firmness. If a section sagged too much, threatening to let water seep into the planted rows, they packed fresh mud against it. Again, nothing rushed. Just slow scoops of earth pressed into place, reinforcing the edges with a serenity that made the entire process look like repairing a sandcastle at a very patient pace. By the time the sky turned deep blue, small lanterns appeared along some chinampas. These weren't bright lamps, just candles or pottery jars with glowing embers inside, enough light to guide a keeper's steps without shattering the softness of the night. The lantern glow reflected on the water, doubling the warm flicker so that the canals looked alive with tiny moving stars. In the distance, Tenochtitlan hummed with its own sounds, markets closing, families finishing meals, distant drums tapping out slow rhythms. But here, on these watery farmlands, things stayed quiet and grounded. The gardens existed just outside the city's pulse, like a calmer world running parallel to the livelier one. Among the crops, nighttime visitors moved freely. Small rodents scurried along the edges, harmless for the most part, though the keepers watched them with the kind of resigned patience farmers everywhere use when dealing with creatures who refuse to pay rent. Owls perched in the willows, blinking their large eyes at the darkness, occasionally swooping down to deal with whatever rustled beneath them. Water insects buzzed across the still surfaces. Some skimmed so lightly that the water barely trembled under them. Others flickered in and out of sight, tiny lights catching the lantern glow before disappearing again. The keepers didn't chase them away. They were part of the nightly rhythm, the choreography the chinampas performed whenever the moon took over the sky. Let's drift to another nighttime task, securing the chinampas. Because these artificial islands were made of layered mud, vegetation, and interwoven roots, they needed occasional nighttime reinforcement to prevent erosion. The willows did most of the heavy lifting, but keepers tied some edges with woven reed mats or anchored corners more firmly into the lake floor using long stakes. The sounds of these tasks were soft, just the faint creaking of wood, the quick swish of reeds bending, and the careful splash of poles sinking into the mud. Far from the noisy bustle of daytime markets, this work felt almost meditative. Every so often, two gardeners would meet along the narrow paths, exchanging a nod or quietly murmured update about which section needed fresh packing. There was no urgency. No one barked orders. Everyone knew their role, and the system held together because each small gesture mattered. Let's ease into another detail: how the chinampas changed with the seasons. Though the Valley of Mexico didn't have the dramatic winters or harsh freezes of far northern climates, it did have cycles, rainy periods, drier months, and slight temperature fluctuations that shaped the rhythm of the gardens. During the rainy season, the lake grew fuller and the canals widened. Water became deeper and darker, with the surface broken only by raindrops forming concentric circles. Gardeners adjusted their routines, working more on raising beds, reinforcing edges, and planting crops that thrived with abundant moisture. Canoes became even more essential, gliding between plots that were now slightly farther apart. And in the dry months, the chinampas emerged more prominently from the water. The soil needed more tending. Mud harvesting became more frequent. The keepers scooped lakebed sediment with long poles, pulling it up in slow, heavy motions that made their arms ache in a familiar, steady way. They spread the fresh mud across the plots, smoothing it with wide swipes, filling in cracks left by the sun. The shifting seasons didn't create chaos. The gardeners simply moved with them, adjusting their choreography in the same small, steady ways they adjusted everything else. If the lake rose, they adapted. If it fell, they adapted. And all the while, the chinampas remained the dependable backbone of the city's food supply. Let's glide into the middle of one of those seasonal routines: dredging the canal bottoms. Dredging was slow, slippery work. The keeper leaned over the edge of the canoe with a basket or net tied to a long handle. He lowered it into the murky water, swirling it gently to scoop up silt. Then, with a smooth lift, he brought it to the surface, mud dripping heavily from the bottom, before depositing it in the canoe. Round after round, he repeated the motion, each lift a little heavier than the last, until the canoe carried a dark mound of fresh sediment. The keeper spread it on the chinampa in soft, even layers, patting it into place as if tucking something into bed. Doing this year after year created the chinampa's remarkable fertility. The lake bed constantly renewed itself. The soil never tired, and the gardeners kept the cycle turning with their careful, rhythmic gestures. Let's drift toward the plants themselves, the quiet stars of this watery world. Maize rose in tall, orderly rows, its leaves rustling gently even in the slightest breeze. Beans, the classic companions of corn, curled gracefully up the stalks, winding themselves with natural precision. Squash spread low across the soil, its vines curling outward like sleepy fingers stretching across a blanket. Some chinampas held flowers, bright marigolds, delicate dahlias, which served practical purposes like deterring pests or marking boundaries. Others grew chilies, amaranth, and edible herbs. Even cacao trees grew in some areas, though more often in drier regions. Each plant had its place and purpose, and the keepers moved among them with the easy familiarity of caretakers who knew exactly which leaves to watch, which stems to support, and which spots needed more mud. It wasn't glamorous. No royal gardens here. No manicured hedges or decorative fountains. Just plants doing their job and gardeners doing theirs, in a partnership so old and steady that it barely needed words. Let's move to the social rhythm of the chinampa world. Though each keeper managed his own plot, or his family's, the chinampas formed a network. Neighbors relied on each other for help, especially in the rainy season when storms threatened to flood the canals. If one chinampa weakened, the next could follow, so everyone had a vested interest in keeping the system balanced. When a storm approached, you could see the coordination unfold slowly. Keepers tied their canoes more securely. They checked the willow roots. They gathered reeds to reinforce weak edges. No shouting. No frantic scrambling. just calm preparation, like people who had done this dozens of times before. Sometimes families gathered on the chinampas in the late afternoon. Children splashed in the shallows, staying close to the edges so they didn't drift out too far. Elders sat under the willows, weaving reed mats, offering quiet advice, or commenting on how the water level was just a little higher than last year. Whether that was accurate or not didn't matter. Elders earned the right to say whatever they wanted about water. At times, a chinampa keeper offered small gifts to the lake spirits. A few drops of pulque, a handful of flowers, or a bit of food. It wasn't an elaborate ceremony, just a simple gesture acknowledging the partnership between land and water, garden and caretaker. Let's drift back to the night again. Around midnight, the chinampas became still enough that even the frogs settled down. The wind quieted, the willows stopped swaying, and the water reflected the sky with such clarity that the stars looked like they rested directly on the surface. This was the hour when the chinampas felt most alive in their quietness. A keeper walking along the narrow embankment would hear almost nothing, just the soft crunch of earth underfoot and the occasional whisper of water brushing against the shore. The crops stood silent, the gardens breathed slowly, and the entire landscape seemed to exhale, preparing itself for the next day of careful tending. Among all this, one might notice tiny details: the glint of a snail moving across a damp stone, the shadow of a bat swooping overhead, the faint rustle of a fish breaking the surface. They were small moments, but each contributed to the chinampa's rhythm. And the keepers understood this rhythm instinctively. They weren't performers learning choreography. They were part of the choreography itself. They moved with the land, the water, the plants, and the seasons. Everything was connected, not through grand rituals, but through countless tiny gestures made day after day. We can float right back into the gardens. No build-up, no fanfare, just more slow, meandering steps through the lives of people whose job was to keep the entire Aztec capital watered, fed, and not sinking face-first into mud. A peaceful task, a repetitive task, exactly the kind of task our sleepy exploration appreciates. So let's drift over to the elders, those long-serving keepers of the chinampas who had already spent decades pushing through reeds, tending to canals, and occasionally muttering about younger workers who didn't know proper mud anymore. These elders weren't necessarily old by modern standards. Lifespans weren't exactly generous. But if you were over 50, with knees that crackled louder than a Tenochtitlan festival torch, you were basically the local sage of squelchy earth. Their mornings began before the sun rose over the Sierra Madre. They woke quietly, often sitting up with a gentle groan that communicated both age and long-trained resignation. Outside, the chinampa canals were still silver and cool. The air hovered above them as a soft mist, just thin enough to see the early movement of ducks paddling past like sleepy chaperones. Elders tended to begin the day with something light, usually a warm drink, sometimes a simple masa mixture, nothing too dramatic. They weren't warriors gearing up for battle. They were people preparing to prune a leafy bed of amaranth, and they took their time doing so. One elder, according to a Spanish observer, preferred to sit for several minutes staring into the morning mist as if he was waiting for it to deliver today's instructions. It's unclear whether the mist ever did. Once ready, they would walk toward the gardens, which for them was a familiar parade of simple motions. Each footstep had a rhythm. They weren't rushing. Chinampa life rarely required hurry. The canals were calm. The air was calm. Even the birds seemed to time their morning calls around whatever pace the elders set, which was unhurried at best. When they reached their assigned garden, the elders performed a slow survey of the space. They gently pushed at the soil with a stick, checked water levels, and watched for wilting stalks with the same level of care a modern librarian uses when spotting someone folding a page. They weren't dramatic about their duties. They just quietly existed inside a ritual they had repeated thousands of times. And despite their age, elders rarely retired. Not fully. The Aztecs didn't really do the sit in a hammock until someone brings guacamole version of retirement. Instead, elders continued to work, just softer, and with more opinions, especially about the way chinampa work used to be done. They had a fondness for telling stories that began with phrases like, back when the canals behaved themselves, as if the waterways had once been significantly more polite. Let's float from one elder to another, drifting like leaves across a sleepy canal. Over on a longer chinampa in a quieter district, another elder, this one known for his habit of humming tuneless melodies, began his morning by gently brushing soil off the roots of chives. He wasn't fixing anything catastrophic. He was simply making sure the roots didn't suffocate under too much moisture. It was a precise act, almost meditative. You'd think he was cleaning a collection of delicate figurines instead of garden plants. He kept humming. No one knew what the tune was. Possibly even he didn't know. But he hummed it so regularly that a Spanish friar mentioned it in his writings, calling it the old gardener's river song, which gives it a poetic flair the humming probably didn't earn. Another elder preferred to perform miniature water tests. He would scoop up a handful of canal water, let it run through his fingers, and watch its clarity, density, and scent. The way he did it, you'd think he was judging wine. But no, he simply wanted to know whether runoff from last night's rain had changed the soil moisture balance. He made a face whenever the water tasted too mineral heavy. Yes, he tasted it, which is, admittedly, one way to perform quality control. But elder life wasn't all serene routines. Sometimes, they had to manage small disputes. For example, younger workers occasionally drifted into the wrong chinampa by accident. The canals could be confusing, and plants often looked similar. The elders responded by making a slow, unimpressed gesture with their hands, something that roughly translated to, "Child, you are in the wrong mud." They didn't yell. They didn't scold. They simply radiated disappointment with the calmness of a sun-warmed stone. Let's drift over to the social side of their lives. Elders often gathered in small groups during midday breaks. No frantic lunch hours. Just easy conversation while sitting on the edge of a chinampa, feet dangling an inch above the water. They shared food. They traded gossip, nothing spicy, just quiet, low-stakes gossip about things like whose canal maintenance was slipping or whose maize rows seemed slightly crooked this season. It wasn't harmful gossip, just the gentle commentary of people who had earned the right to be judgmental in a relaxed way. They also served as the community's memory archive. Young chinampa workers frequently asked them how to fix specific problems. How to repair a cracked retaining wall. How to keep tomatoes from drooping after a storm. How to keep the water flowing properly during dry seasons. Elders answered slowly, not because they were hiding the secret knowledge, but because everything was slow here. Their explanations were methodical, repetitive, and filled with little side notes like, "Make sure you don't use those reeds, trust me," which raised questions no one bothered to ask. Let's float to another detail, elder rituals. Sometimes, early in the year, chinampa communities held quiet ceremonies before planting. Nothing big, just offerings placed at the water's edge. A small basket of flowers. A few kernels of maize. The elders oversaw these rituals, performing them with the steady confidence of people who had done the exact same gestures for half a century. They didn't give speeches. They didn't gather crowds. They simply placed offerings into the water and watched them drift toward the horizon, trusting that the watery spirits, if they cared at all, would take the hint. One elder, in particular, had a habit of whispering a short phrase to the water before planting season. No one understood it. A Spanish chronicler wrote it phonetically but admitted he wasn't sure he heard it correctly. It may have been an old family line, or a joke, or maybe he was just muttering about the weather. But either way, it became a tradition, and the younger gardeners occasionally imitated it in private, hoping it would make their crops as effortlessly healthy as his. Now let's glide toward discussion of elder responsibilities in community planning. Chinampa districts weren't anarchic. They had organization, rules, and rough schedules. Elders played a quiet but essential role in setting those schedules. If an embankment needed reinforcement, elders arranged the timing. If the planting season needed adjusting due to unusual rainfall, elders made that call. Their decisions weren't flashy. Nobody held grand meetings. Instead, elders simply talked among themselves in calm tones and then mentioned the final plan to the younger workers the next morning as though it had always been obvious. They were also the keepers of garden choreography. Yes, the actual human choreography. Younger workers learned the basic movements from them. How to bend without tearing roots. How to lift soil without compacting it. How to move a canoe through narrow canals without knocking over reed markers. Elders demonstrated each motion slowly, almost artistically. Watching them work was like watching someone perform an improvised dance made of small, precise gestures. Nothing dramatic, just an unbroken flow of calm efficiency. Let's drift toward the emotional landscape of these elders. They weren't stern. They weren't distant. Most seemed quietly amused by life. They had that particular humor older people sometimes get, the gentle, tired kind based on decades of repeating the same tasks. When a young worker dropped a basket of beans into the canal, elders didn't get angry. They just raised their eyebrows with a look that said, "You'll remember this lesson longer than anything I say, won't you?" Occasionally, elders took pleasure in telling long stories, stories that didn't necessarily have a point. Stories wandering through topics the way canoes wandered through canals. A story might begin about a storm 20 years ago, drift into an anecdote about a neighbor's stubborn goose, wander into commentary about reed prices, and end with a sentence like, "And that's why we never plant amaranth before a good thaw." Even if the listener didn't understand the connection, the elder did. Probably. Let's float toward one elder's daily end-of-work routine. One man, named in a few records, would finish his day by smoothing the soil of his chinampa with a flat wooden board. It wasn't required. It didn't make a huge difference. But he said it helped the land sleep. A poetic notion, probably, but he was consistent about it. At dusk, long after the younger gardeners had headed home, he stayed and smoothed the earth, stroke by stroke, in a rhythmic pattern that blended into the quiet evening sounds. Eventually, other elders adopted similar habits, tiny closing rituals that helped them mentally transition from work to rest. When the day finally ended, the elders made their way home along narrow canal paths. The sky washed in soft red tones. The water reflected the dying light. Canoes rocked gently at the edges, tethered like patient animals. The elders walked slowly, mindful of their footing, and enjoyed the consistent coolness of the water-filled breeze. Chapter 5. Quiet Alliances on the Water. The chinampas shift again beneath the soft glaze of morning light, and we drift back into the routines that played out across the canals with all the urgency of a slowly melting candle. No introductions needed. No grand announcements. Just another gentle slide into the daily patterns of people whose entire world moved at the pace of water. By this chapter, we've already floated through gardeners, families, elders, and a handful of stubborn, humming workers who probably didn't realize their songs would eventually be recorded by confused Spanish friars. Now we turn to the less obvious figures, the quiet coordinators and patient negotiators who kept the chinampa system running not just through planting and harvesting, but through something far more delicate, cooperation. Because if there's one thing the chinampa world required, it was alliances. Not political alliances with dramatic speeches and elaborate feathered headdresses, though the Aztecs had plenty of those elsewhere. Here, alliances were simple, unspoken, and often sealed with nothing more than shared labor and a handful of water reeds tied neatly into a bundle. Let's float toward the first group, the canal balancers. These were individuals who took it upon themselves to manage the water levels across interconnected plots. Not official officers. Not appointed nobles. Just people who understood water better than most. They knew how to read currents, how to anticipate rainfall, and how to make peace between neighbors who insisted the water on their side of the canal was either too high or too low, depending, of course, on what was convenient that day. A canal balancer's day started by stepping into the shallow water, feeling the current wrap around their ankles, and assessing its mood. Water did have moods, at least according to chinampa workers. It could be calm, irritated, lazy, unpredictable. And while younger workers sometimes exaggerated these traits, blaming moody water for their own clumsy canoe navigation, balancers took the idea seriously. They approached water like a colleague with whom they had to negotiate gently. Their tools were simple: reed bundles, wooden stakes, and occasionally a clay scoop they used to redirect small flows. They made tiny adjustments that looked insignificant to the untrained eye. Move one reed bundle a few inches. Shift a stake slightly left. Repack the edge of a canal wall with firmer mud. These micro-changes eventually stabilized entire garden districts. It was a delicate dance. And yes, there was choreography here too, just slower, softer, grounded in intuition rather than formal rules. Let's drift to the next group, the compost carriers. These were the unsung heroes who carted nutrient-rich lake muck from canal bottoms to garden beds. Compost may not sound glamorous, and that's because it wasn't. But in the chinampa system, it was gold. The muck was rich, soft, and full of nutrients that kept crops thriving. Compost carriers moved with steady, deliberate steps. They dipped long-handled nets into the murky canal bottoms, bringing up scoops of sludge that glistened in the morning light with the elegance of, well, sludge. Then they piled it onto reed mats, lifted them with a practiced shrug, and carried them toward the garden plots. Their pace was predictable. Never rushed. Never sluggish. Just consistent. If you watched them for long enough, you'd start to believe their footsteps were part of the natural drumbeat of the chinampa world. These workers formed quiet alliances too. One garden might need more muck than another. One canal bottom might be low on nutrients after a heavy season. Compost carriers solved these issues not by arguing or debating but by simply helping each other. If one carrier had extra, they offered it to another without discussion. No dramatic negotiations. Just cooperation shaped by years of routine. Let's drift onward. Another key group were the reed cutters, the people responsible for harvesting the tall, flexible reeds used in building, repairing, and reinforcing chinampa edges. Reed cutters moved deeper into quieter sections of the lake, where dense patches of reeds swayed gently in the breeze like half-awake performers in their own slow-motion show. Reed cutting had its own rhythm: cut, bundle, put, carry, cut, bundle, put, carry. And just like that, they built the bones of the chinampas. Reeds were essential for stabilizing plots, marking boundaries, reinforcing canal walls, and creating floating mats used during planting season. Without reeds, chinampas would simply dissolve into the lake. Because reeds were vital, cutters often formed alliances with gardeners who needed more materials. These alliances weren't formal agreements. They were quiet exchanges. A gardener would ask politely. A reed cutter would nod. No writing. No ceremony. Just a shared understanding that one person needed something and another had the skill to provide it. Let's drift closer to a quieter part of chinampa life, the midday gatherings. Around noon, when the sun warmed the canal waters and the shadows shortened, workers often met at small gathering points, simple platforms or shaded areas made of packed reeds and mud. There, they shared tortillas, heated maize drinks, grilled fish, or a handful of beans soaked earlier in the morning. The conversations weren't fiery. They weren't political. Mostly they revolved around the weather, crop behavior, small repairs that needed doing, and occasionally one of the subtle rivalries that emerged between gardeners. For example, someone might casually point out that their neighbor's squash plants seemed a little tired, which in chinampa language was somewhere between friendly teasing and a mild agricultural insult. Alliances grew here, in these small exchanges. Someone might offer extra seedlings. Someone else might help repair a wall that had slumped toward the canal overnight. The chinampa world ran on these invisible social threads. Let's move toward the harvest cooperatives. Harvesting in the chinampas rarely happened alone. Most plants ripened in manageable waves, and when a large quantity of amaranth or beans or chili peppers became ready, neighboring families and workers teamed up to gather everything before the weather changed. These weren't rushed harvests, not the frantic kind you see in places where crops would spoil within hours. In the chinampa world, timing was flexible, and workers moved with a practiced calm. The typical scene might look like this. Several people kneel on a chinampa bed, hands brushing soil gently as they remove vegetables one at a time. They place them into reed baskets lined with leaves to keep the produce cool. Someone hums softly. Someone else tells a long-winded story about a particularly stubborn pumpkin they once harvested. A third person rinses their hands in the canal water between tasks. No drama, no urgency, just a quiet team effort. Let's float to the market ferryman. people whose entire role was transporting harvested goods by canoe to the bustling markets of Tlatelolco and Tenochtitlan. Their canoes were long and narrow, gliding through the canals like sleepy water snakes. Ferrymen learned every route by heart. They navigated with slow, steady strokes, keeping balance even when their canoes were stacked high with baskets. But here's the ironic truth. Many ferrymen weren't particularly talkative. They spent so much time navigating the quiet canals that once they reached the loud, crowded markets, they preferred to unload their goods quickly and return to the peace of the Chinampa district. Cooperation with gardeners was essential. They timed their visits around harvests, guided by gentle agreements and soft-spoken planning. Let's drift into another layer of the system, shared canal maintenance. Every so often, canals needed clearing. Algae thickened. Watergrasses grew too long. Debris drifted in from storms. When this happened, neighbors came together to perform a slow, organized cleaning. Workers pushed long poles through the water, gathering vegetation into floating piles. Then someone would steer a canoe underneath, letting the vegetation slide in like a sleepy mass of green noodles. These maintenance days were peaceful but strangely social. They were the Chinampa equivalent of a quiet neighborhood workday, everyone doing something small, collectively keeping the space alive. Let's float onward to the repair teams. Occasionally, a Chinampa wall slumped into the canal, usually after heavy rain. Repairing it required cooperation. Workers packed mud, layered reeds, patted everything into place with flat paddles, and shaped the edges so they wouldn't topple again. The process was slow, repetitive, and soothing. One person placed reeds. Another carried mud. A third pressed the wall, smoothing it until it looked like a perfectly folded blanket of earth. These teamwork rituals kept the Chinampa world stable and reminded everyone that the floating gardens weren't individual creations. They were collective works, shaped by dozens of hands over long stretches of time. Let's drift to a final group for this chapter, the quiet decision-makers. These weren't formal leaders. No titles. No formal power. They were simply the people others trusted, men and women known for calm judgment and steady hands. When issues rose, things like borderline disputes, water allocation concerns, or shared harvest schedules, these quiet decision-makers listened, nodded slowly, and offered practical solutions. Not grand solutions. Not poetic solutions. Just simple answers like, move your marker 3 steps to the left. Let the canal rest 2 days. Plant later next moon. And somehow, these plain, sleepy lines held everything together. The Chinampa system didn't thrive because of dramatic rulers or famous warriors. It thrived because of alliances, soft, steady, unspoken agreements between gardeners, carriers, cutters, ferrymen, and countless others who moved through the water with patience carved into their bones. Chapter 6. The Slow Language of Chinampa Tools. Approximate 1,700 to 1,900 words. The tools of the Chinampa keepers barely made a sound. That's the first thing worth mentioning as we drift into another quiet layer of their world. No clanging metal. No sharp ringing. Nothing that would shatter the soft mood of a place defined by water and patience. Instead, their tools answered to the environment. A set of simple wooden implements shaped by decades of routine and a working philosophy that valued silence almost as much as productivity. There's something peaceful in that. Tools that didn't demand attention. Tools that didn't make a point of being impressive. Tools that just existed, steady and ready, like old friends who didn't require small talk. Let's ease into the first one, the COA. A COA was a long-handled digging stick used all across Mesoamerica. In the Chinampas, it functioned as an all-purpose helper. Planting? Use a COA. Loosening soil? Use a COA. Adjusting tiny water channels between rows? Use a COA but gently. People wielded it with the same kind of casual precision a modern person uses while stirring tea. The Chinampa keepers didn't stab the ground. They didn't hack at it. Their movements were slow and circular. They pushed the COA downward, rotated it slightly, and lifted soil with the care of someone lifting a sleeping cat. The tool's rhythm created a quiet pattern across the gardens. Tap, turn, lift, settle, soft enough that the birds barely bothered to pause their morning calls. The COA might look plain to us, but to chinampa workers it was almost an extension of the hand. Older gardeners carved slight curves or grooves into their handles so the tool fit their grip perfectly. Sometimes, after decades of use, the handle smoothed itself naturally from the oils in the gardener's palms. Each one became its own archive of labor, subtle dents and polished spots telling the story of countless plantings and repairs. Let's float toward the next tool, the mud paddle. These paddles were broad, flat boards attached to straight handles. Gardeners used them for shaping the earthen walls of chinampas, smoothing the surfaces, and pressing fresh mud into place after repairs. If the COA was a flexible helper, the mud paddle was the quiet sculptor of the lake world. Working with it required slow, steady strokes. Back and forth, down and across. Each motion compressed the soil and reeds into a firm structure that resisted water seepage. Watching someone use a mud paddle was a bit like watching someone iron fabric while half asleep. Slow passes, a small shift of weight, and then another slow pass. No rush, no struggle, just a kind of hypnotic repetition. Let's drift to the reed knife. Despite the intimidating name, this wasn't a dramatic blade. It was a practical tool with a slightly curved wooden handle and a modest stone or copper cutting edge. Reed cutters used it to slice through thick clusters of tules and cattails, selecting only the straightest, strongest stalks for building. Reed cutting wasn't a job for people in a hurry. The workers waded knee-deep through the shallows, water soaking their woven sandals, reeds brushing softly against their shoulders. They bent each stalk gently to test for flexibility. They listened to the faint rustle of reed fibers. They cut slowly, making a single clean motion just above the waterline. Each reed was part of the future of a chinampa, reinforcing walls, shaping mats, marking boundaries. Reed knives enabled that slow transformation. Now let's glide over to the pole, the tool used for canoe propulsion. This wasn't just a stick. In the chinampa world, it was a quiet transportation device, long and sturdy, usually carved from ahujote wood. Ferrymen held the pole vertically, pressed it to the bottom of the canal, and pushed off gently. The motion was smooth, almost meditative. Push, glide, reset, push, glide, reset. Watching ferrymen move through the canals with these poles was like watching someone drift through a dream, barely disturbing the water, barely breaking the air. The canal paths they traced each day were so consistent that locals could identify ferrymen by the tiny wakes they left behind, the way modern people might recognize someone's handwriting. Let's drift toward the woven baskets used for carrying produce. These baskets were crafted from reeds and fibers, light but surprisingly durable. Gardeners packed them with beans, squash, herbs, flowers, or whatever the season offered. The baskets swung gently at their sides as they walked, brushing against their knees. Some workers lined them with leaves to keep delicate produce cool. Others tied simple geometric designs into the weaving, nothing too fancy, just enough to give their basket a bit of personality. Basket makers formed their own quiet craft network. They sat in shaded areas along the canals, weaving long strips of fibers into tight spirals. Their movements were slow enough that it often looked like they were doing nothing at all, just turning reeds in their fingers lazily. But hour after hour, a basket would emerge, shaped by tiny decisions and gentle adjustments. Let's ease toward the sifter baskets used in seed preparation. These were shallow, flat trays woven more loosely than the carrying baskets. Before planting, gardeners used them to clean seeds. They poured maize or amaranth onto the surface. They rocked the tray back and forth, letting dust and broken husk pieces fall through the gaps while the seeds rolled in soft waves. The sound was faint, a dry, shushing whisper, perfect for a place dedicated to calm labor. The act of sifting seeds was almost meditative. Gardeners often did it while sitting on the edges of chinampas, letting their feet graze the surface of the canal water. They shook the tray gently, watching sunlight catch on the grains. For many, it was a peaceful break in the day, a transitional moment before planting began. Let's drift toward another essential group of tools, the dredging nets. Canal maintenance used nets made from plant fibers, stretched across wooden frames. Workers dipped them into the canal bottoms and pulled up lake sediment, nutrient-rich muck that became fertilizer. The nets didn't clatter or scrape. They slid into the water with a soft swoosh, then rose heavy and dripping. Dredging was slow work. You couldn't rush the muck. It settled on its own schedule, thick and cooperative only when handled gently. Workers moved in a cycle: lower the net, scoop, lift, drain, dump. A careful rotation of movements that kept canals deep enough for canoes and gardens healthy enough for harvests. Now let's float gently toward the planting trays used for seedlings. Before planting season, chinampa keepers prepared seedlings in shallow reed trays filled with fine lake mud. They placed the trays in sunny patches along the garden edges, watering them with small handfuls of canal water. The trays acted like nurseries, protecting delicate early shoots from wind and water shifts. Gardeners checked them daily, leaning close to inspect each tiny leaf. They whispered about the weather. They shaded the seedlings with their hands during the intense midday sun. These trays represented patience made physical, weeks of waiting before the plants were strong enough to move into the garden beds. Let's drift into the quieter aspects of tool maintenance. Chinampa workers didn't treat tools as disposable. They repaired them, rewrapped handles, resharpened blades with slow stone strokes, replaced worn bindings, and occasionally rubbed wood with plant oils to keep it from cracking. Tool care wasn't a task, it was a relationship. Evening was the usual time for repairs. Workers sat near the canal edges, tools spread across their laps, soft orange light settling on their shoulders as the sun dipped behind distant hills. They worked without hurry, sometimes humming, sometimes exchanging simple comments with each other. The handle's loose again. This one needs a new reed binding. The paddle edge won't last another season without help. Quiet problems, quiet solutions. Let's float now to the ceremonial tools, rare but meaningful. Some chinampa keepers used special versions of their everyday tools during planting rituals, decorated koas with carved patterns or polished mud paddles reserved only for the first planting of the season. These weren't sacred in a dramatic sense. They were just special, like holiday dishes that only appear once a year. During rituals, workers used these tools slowly, carefully, planting the first seeds of the cycle with deliberate motions. They murmured hopes for good growth, guided by generations of tradition. Then, once the ceremony ended, the decorated tools were cleaned and stored away until next season. Let's drift toward the musical tools, which appeared without much planning. These weren't real instruments. They were just work tools that happened to make pleasant noises. A reed knife tapping gently against a canoe edge. A basket brushing softly against another basket. A pole dipping into the water in a slow, rhythmic splash. Sometimes workers used these accidental sounds to keep time with each other, creating unintentional music as they collaborated. You could drift along the canals and hear patterns. Tap, tip, tip, or push, glide, ripple, push, or shake, whisper, shake. No orchestration. Just the natural soundscape of people working gently in an environment that rewarded softness. Finally, we drift toward the larger truth. In the chinampa world, tools didn't define the workers. The workers shaped the tools. Slowly, patiently, practically. Each tool was a partner, not a burden. Each motion was deliberate, refined over years of watching water, plants, and soil behave in predictable cycles. And as these tools moved through the chinampa world, carried in canoes, rested against reed walls, lifted in the soft morning mist, they became part of the environment, blending into the slow choreography of the floating gardens. Chapter 7. The Quiet Science of Indigo. How dyed cloth became a cooling technology ****. If you place a piece of deep blue indigo cloth in sunlight today, it's easy to admire the color without thinking much about the centuries of experimentation that made that blue possible. But in West Africa, long before temperature maps, airflow studies, or modern thermodynamics, dyers treated indigo not just as a pigment but as a cooling device. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the textile traditions of regions like Mali, Senegal, and Niger, where artisans learned that the bluest cloth was often the coolest cloth. This chapter explores the quiet, practical science behind that knowledge. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just the steady, patient work of people who made cloth that could breathe, reflect light, and physically cool the wearer. It is slow, gentle history, perfect for drifting off. A color that cooled the body. Indigo dyeing in West Africa begins in large ceramic pots, each one seasoned over years of use. Inside these pots is a living mixture, warm, slightly foamy, smelling faintly of fermentation and earth. If you look into one of these vats at midday, you'll see the surface shimmering with a thin rainbow-like film. Dyers understand this as a sign that the vat is healthy, its chemistry in balance. What ancient dyers didn't call chemistry, they simply called experience. And through this experience, they discovered something remarkable. Indigo-dyed cotton absorbed heat differently from undyed cotton. Deep blue cloth became warm more slowly in direct sun. But that wasn't the real secret. The real cooling effect came from a set of physical properties dyers preserved intentionally. The heavier indigo layers acted like microscopic shields. The tightly woven threads reduced radiant heat transfer. The slight film left by the dye absorbed sweat, then let it evaporate faster. In short, blue fabric became an ancient wearable cooling system. And all of this knowledge came from quiet observations, thousands of days of watching cloth dry in warm air, feeling how it behaved during work, and adjusting techniques accordingly. The slow rhythm of dyeing. Imagine a courtyard in a town along the Niger River. It is late afternoon, when the sun has begun to soften. The dyeing vats sit under a shelter, each one like a sleeping animal breathing through faint bubbles. Women carry narrow strips of cotton across the courtyard and lower them gently into the dye. The strips disappear into darkness, turning a murky green before slowly shifting toward the deep indigo we recognize. There is no rush. Indigo doesn't respond well to rushing. The cloth must be dipped repeatedly, often dozens of times, sometimes more. Each dip creates a new microscopic layer of dye that gives the fabric durability and, interestingly, a more effective cooling property. Dyers didn't talk about molecules or heat absorption. They simply knew that cloth dipped many times stays cool on a hot day. The process is slow, dyeing, airing, dipping again, airing again. Hours pass quietly. The courtyard becomes a peaceful clock, ticking not with gears but with the rhythm of repetition. Fabric is shade. Textiles from indigo-rich regions were often woven into narrow bands before being stitched together. A typical garment might consist of 8 to 14 strips, each one about the width of a hand. This method gave the cloth a remarkably breathable structure. Tiny gaps between the joined strips allowed air to pass through, while the indigo layers blocked harsh sunlight. People wore these indigo garments not only as everyday clothing, but also as practical shade. Travelers draped them over the head, wrapped them around the torso, or used them as makeshift curtains on the side of shelters. The cloth didn't cool people the way ice cools water. Instead, it softened the heat, like sitting beneath a tree rather than out in the open. The indigo traders of the Sahel. Travelers along the old Sahelian caravan routes often remarked on the deep blue garments worn by the people of cities like Jen and Timbuktu. Some merchants from faraway regions believed the cloth was dyed with something rare or magical. The color was so intense that it seemed to shine. But the secret wasn't magic. It was the long, slow fermentation of indigo leaves, watched over carefully through changing seasons. A vat might be fed with ash water during cold months, strengthened with millet porridge during dry months, or moderated with clay when it grew too strong. The vat was alive and needed tending like a household companion. Merchants valued this cloth not only for its color but for its comfort. When traveling under desert sun, even a small indigo headscarf could make the difference between exhaustion and ease. Some traders believed the cloth captured shadows. Others said it pushed away the sun. These weren't literal explanations, just poetic ways of describing a real physical effect. Breathable weaves and cooling wisdom. The indigo color was only half the cooling secret. West African weaving techniques completed the system. A common style produced a cloth with very tight vertical threads, slightly looser horizontal threads, a gentle texture that lifted the cloth just slightly off the skin. This combination allowed tiny pockets of air to form beneath the fabric. Air pockets, Even small ones improve cooling dramatically in hot, dry climates. Again, ancient weavers didn't use scientific language. They simply described the cloth as light, lifting, or breathing. Over generations, these subtle adjustments turned indigo garments into tools for climate control. The quiet work of beating cloth. One final step completed the cooling transformation, beating the cloth with wooden mallets. Dyers laid finished strips on smooth stone slabs and tapped them rhythmically. A slow, steady beat that could last for hours. This beating polished the indigo layers, made the cloth softer, pressed the fibers into their most breathable arrangement. A well-beaten indigo cloth became almost glossy. When worn, it reflected more sunlight and clung less to the body. It stayed cooler during long walks, long working days, and long stretches of dry season heat. Some historians call this a finishing process. But really, it was the final chapter of a long conversation between people and their environment, a cooling technology hidden in plain sight. Today, when we talk about ways people kept cool before fans and air conditioning, we often imagine palm leaf fans or thick mud walls. But indigo cloth deserves a place among those technologies. It was part shade, part insulation, part breathable mesh, part evaporative cooling system. Every step, from leaf fermentation to weaving to beating, contributed to its cooling properties. And all of it came from knowledge passed through hands, not textbooks. In the quiet corners of dying courtyards, cooling science was practiced without ever being named. Chapter 8: Fabrics that Breathe. How West African looms turned thread into airflow ***. When you look at a piece of hand-woven West African cloth, it's easy to see beauty in the colors, the patterns, the repeating geometric stripes. But beneath that beauty lies something quieter, something more practical. A built-in airflow system, created not with blueprints or formulas but with steady hands and generations of practice. This chapter explores how the loom itself shaped cooling textiles, and how weavers designed cloth that acted almost like woven wind. You don't need to picture anything dramatic. Just imagine a shady courtyard, a wooden loom, and the gentle tapping of the shuttle. It's slow, peaceful history, perfect for drifting deeper into rest. The narrowband weaving tradition. Across regions of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and northern Ghana, one of the most distinctive features of traditional cloth is its narrow width. Instead of creating a single large piece of fabric, weavers created long strips, often no wider than a hand. These strips were then stitched together to form garments, blankets, or wrappers. Why so narrow? Because narrow strips stretch evenly, breathe more naturally, and remain light enough for one person to manage without losing tension. This design created a cloth that moved with the wind rather than resisting it. In a warm climate, that movement was part of the cooling system. Each strip became a miniature panel of airflow, flexible enough to contour to the body, structured enough to never trap heat. When multiple strips were joined, the tiny seams between them added faint channels where air could slip through. The effect was subtle, but in the midday heat, subtle advantages mattered. The loom as a cooling device. A traditional West African loom is a quiet machine. It sits close to the ground, made of wood and rope, sometimes shaded by a simple canopy. The weaver sits low, usually with legs extended or folded, guiding the shuttle back and forth through the threads. The loom's design naturally creates a particular type of cloth. Tight vertical warp threads, slightly looser horizontal weft threads, a texture that softens over time. This arrangement allows air to move through the fabric while still giving the cloth strength. Even without scientific terminology, weavers understood that too tight a weave trapped heat, while too loose a weave wore out quickly. So they found the balance, the breathing weave. A cloth that lasted, a cloth that cooled, a cloth perfect for long days under Sahelian sun, a rhythm measured in breath. If you sat near a working loom in early morning, you would hear a soft pattern. The sound comes from the heddle lifting and lowering the warp threads. That steady rhythm shapes the cloth's airflow. With each pass of the shuttle, a microscopic gap is created, a space where air can live inside the cloth, cooling the wearer. Weavers didn't study physics, but they learned through touch. They could run fingers across a new strip of cloth and feel whether it would hold heat or release it. Their palms were the instruments, and the loom was the laboratory. Cotton grown for breathability. Long staple cotton, the kind historically grown around the Niger Bend, played a major role in making cooling cloth possible. The fibers were smooth, slightly shiny, and long enough to be spun into strong, lightweight thread. When woven, this cotton created a fabric that could catch a breeze even in still air. The cotton fibers naturally wicking moisture. Evaporation happened at a slow, steady pace. Cooling followed quietly. No ice, no metal, no mechanical tools. Just cotton doing what cotton does best when guided by patient hands. Joining strips, a hidden cooling trick. When a garment was assembled from multiple narrow strips, artisans joined them with careful stitching. The thread used for joining wasn't merely functional. It also affected how the cloth breathed. A stitch pulled too tight restricted airflow. A stitch too loose weakened the cloth. So the seams were made with deliberate, even pressure. While the weaving created the main airflow channels, the joining created auxiliary ones, small enough to be invisible but large enough to let heat escape. People wearing these garments might not think consciously about the seams, but the seams were quietly working, always helping. Cloth that moved like water. Another cooling advantage of narrowband cloth was its ability to flow. Because each strip had a natural flexibility, a completed garment moved gracefully with the wearer. When walking or sitting or working, the cloth shifted and lifted with the breeze. Movement itself became cooling. A single step created a slight wave in the garment. That wave allowed warm air to escape. Cooler air replaced it. It was not dramatic cooling, not the sharp coldness of shade after sun. Instead, it was a gentle, continuous comfort, like walking with a small breeze that never quite stopped. Why indigo and weaving worked so well together. Earlier chapters explored how indigo dye itself had cooling properties, layers of dye reflecting heat, cloth resisting rapid warming, surface texture interacting with sweat. When you combine those indigo benefits with the breathing structure of narrowband weaving, the result is something remarkable. An entire garment that, shielded from sunlight, released trapped heat, circulated air, stayed comfortable for hours. The partnership between dyers and weavers wasn't accidental. Over generations, the cloth and the dye evolved together. A quiet collaboration that produced textiles perfectly suited to the environment. This was technology shaped not by sudden invention, but by centuries of observation. Cloth as climate knowledge. Before writing was common in many communities, knowledge lived in craft. Weavers taught apprentices how fabric should feel between the fingers, how tight the tension should be, how to adjust the loom for seasonal humidity. The loom became a form of memory. Each weaver carried the past in their hands. Each cloth carried solutions to heat that were thousands of years old. In a world without thermometers, airflow meters, or scientific papers, cooling knowledge was woven, worn, and passed from one body to another. The quiet genius of everyday tools. When people imagine ancient technologies, they often think of metalwork, ships, or architecture. But the loom, simple, wooden, steady, was a cooling tool as essential as any shelter or courtyard design. A person didn't need a house to cool them. Sometimes they just needed the right fabric, the right weave, the right tension, the right rhythm of warp and weft. This wasn't grand innovation. It wasn't meant to impress. It was just well-made cloth, created slowly, for real lives in real heat. And that quiet genius is what makes it perfect for this series, gentle history, made to let the mind rest. If you'd like, I can con. Chapter 9. The Gardeners Who Never Stopped Moving. Daily Life on the Chinampa Pathways ****. The floating gardens of the Aztec world were serene in paintings and surprisingly unserene in real life. They looked peaceful from a distance, long green rectangles framed by canals, trees standing like quiet guardians, and water reflecting everything in soft ripples. But once you stepped onto a chinampa, you learned quickly that the real secret to keeping these gardens alive wasn't magic soil or divine blessing. It was motion. Calm, steady, unending motion. The people who tended these gardens moved constantly, almost like dancers performing a slow, repetitive choreography. You might not notice it at first, especially if you were watching with sleepy eyes from a canoe. But after a while, the pattern showed itself. A gardener would take a few steps forward, bend, shift their weight, turn, step back, glide sideways, reach again, and continue. Over hours, those little movements became a kind of gentle performance, unintentional, completely practical, and oddly calming to witness. That's where we drift now, into the quiet routines of the people who actually kept the chinampas alive. Morning light, morning tasks. The day started softly. The valley around the lake tended to hold a mild morning haze, the kind that muffled sound and made everything feel a little distant. Gardeners often began before the sun cleared the mountains, mostly because mornings were cooler and working early helped avoid the harsher midday light. A gardener stepped from their canoe onto the chinampa edge, usually stabilizing themselves with a practiced tap of the paddle. These edges could be firm or slightly springy, depending on recent moisture. Over generations, people got so used to the feel that they could tell the garden's condition through their feet alone. If it felt too soft, they knew water had seeped too deep overnight. If it felt too firm, irrigation needed adjusting. And so the first dance of the day began. Slow, assessing steps, weight shifting from heel to toe, checking which sections needed attention. No rush, just a wandering survey with light pressure on the ground. The quiet shuffle of irrigation. Chinampas looked simple, but balancing water levels took constant judgment. Even a peaceful canal could rise or fall slightly with temperature shifts, wind movement, or minor blockages further down. Gardeners knew immediately if something was off. Plants drooped in subtle ways, soil showed faint cracking patterns, and the edges of the chinampa might recede a bit. The gardener responded with a relaxed shuffle from one corner to another, adjusting small openings between the garden and its canal. They used tools, but also hands, feet, and sometimes just a well-placed stick to guide water flow. The result was a motion pattern. Step, check, bend, scoop, shift, step again. Over and over, in a pace that never broke the morning quiet. From a distance, it looked almost meditative, like someone tending the world's calmest, greenest puzzle. Planting in slow rhythm. Planting wasn't a one-time seasonal event. It happened in small intervals because chinampas grew crops year-round. Maize, beans, squash, herbs, flowers, everything came in staggered cycles. Gardeners preferred consistency. It kept the soil balanced, the water levels steady, and the labor manageable. They often planted with both hands working in alternation. Right hand scooping a small opening, left hand placing the seedling, right hand smoothing the soil, left hand adjusting the angle. Then a small retreating step, a shift sideways, and the pattern repeated. If you watched long enough, you'd see that no one stepped randomly. They developed comfortable routes through the rows, always minimizing how often their feet compressed the soil. Their movements curved gently, creating almost crescent-shaped walking paths. Modern onlookers might call it ergonomics. The gardeners probably just called it common sense. Tools that encouraged graceful movement. Most tools were simple. A digging stick, a light hoe, thin paddles for guiding water, baskets for collecting harvested plants, and mats woven from reeds. But their simplicity encouraged smooth, fluid use. A heavy tool forces big motions. A light tool invites small, steady ones. A gardener used these tools like extensions of their arms, never swinging them dramatically, never slamming them into the soil. Instead, each motion matched what the plants needed: gentle loosening, shallow adjustments, tiny rearrangements. Even the harvesting baskets influenced movement. They were often worn on the back or side, requiring balanced steps to keep the load from tipping. That meant slow walking, slightly lowered center of gravity, and an even pace that never startled the plants or disrupted the soil. It all looked unintentionally elegant, the sort of elegance that comes from doing a task thousands of times. The shift and lift of soil care. Chinampa soil wasn't just normal earth. It was carefully layered mud, lake sediment, and organic matter that needed refreshing. This meant that gardeners occasionally scooped mud from canal bottoms and spread it across the topsoil. This task created one of the most distinctive movement patterns of all, the scoop-turn-lift. Scoop with the paddle or basket. Turn with hips rather than feet. Lift or tip the material gently forward. Shift weight back. Repeat. Over time, this motion formed a kind of slow spiral around each garden section. Gardeners rarely walked in straight lines here. Spirals helped distribute weight evenly, reducing erosion and ensuring fresh sediment settled naturally into place. The entire activity could take hours or days, but it was so repetitive and calm that the mind drifted while the body simply continued. The balance of walking on edges. Walking on the narrow borders of a chinampa required footwork, not dramatic balance beam stunts, just a steady, practiced gait. One foot slightly angled outward, the other placing itself in the small safe strip. Ankles stayed flexible. Knees bent. The gardener's eyes stayed low, watching the ground rather than the horizon. It wasn't stressful. If anything, it slowed a person down to the exact pace the chinampa preferred. And this careful edging created yet another choreography pattern, one where gardeners moved along the perimeters in slow loops, making sure the walls of the garden stayed firm. If they spotted a weak spot, they patched it with reeds, mud, or willow roots, working with gentle pressure that kept the structure intact. It was maintenance by mindfulness, no sudden stomp, no rushed repair. Talking through the workday. Gardeners weren't silent. They often worked among family members, neighbors, or apprentices. But the tone of conversation tended to match the work, low, steady, and unhurried. People talked while planting, while adjusting water levels, while sorting herbs into baskets. Conversations drifted in the same pace as the tasks. Someone mentioned that the beets were growing crooked again. Someone else noted that a canoe down the canal looked overloaded as usual. Another person recalled that a distant relative had tried growing chili peppers and somehow angered the local ducks, leading to a minor poultry uprising. Nothing loud. Nothing urgent. Just daily details delivered with the same casual acceptance as the soil they worked with. The talking also helped the rhythm. When hands repeated tasks endlessly, a bit of conversation kept the mind from drifting too far into boredom. And because the gardens were small, voices didn't echo. They just settled into the air like another form of gentle motion. Midday shade breaks. Even steady workers needed rest. Around midday, they usually retreated to shaded edges or small resting mats. They didn't stop moving entirely, just changed to slower tasks like sorting, cleaning tools, or adjusting seedlings in bundles. Sitting down didn't mean stillness. Hands still sorted. Feet still braced. Shoulders still shifted with light work. Even rest had its rhythm. Afternoon work. The mirror of the morning. The afternoon routine often repeated the morning, just in reverse order. Tasks finished earlier were checked again. Water distribution balanced once more. Any new seedlings planted earlier were inspected for wilting. Weeds were removed with an unhurried pinch and pull motion. Gardens never stayed perfect for long, and gardeners expected that. Their movements reflected constant adjustment, not attempts at permanent stability. They were caretakers, not controllers. Partners, not conquerors. Dancers following the garden's lead. Evening departure, a slow retreat. As the light began to dim, gardeners gathered their tools, shook off excess soil, and stepped into their canoes with the same practiced balance they used in the morning. The transition from garden to boat was one last fluid motion, 1 foot anchoring, 1 foot sliding, body leaning slightly forward, paddle dipping into the water with a small swirl. And with that, they drifted home. Not triumphantly, not exhausted, just calmly the same way they worked. Their day had been filled with tiny steps, small bends, gentle turns, and slow repetition. Movements that rarely changed, because the chinampa rarely changed. It simply needed people to act like steady currents of water, always flowing, never rushing. Tomorrow, they would dance it again. Chapter 10, Seeds, Soil, and the Patient Art of Waiting. Once the day's walking, planting, and irrigation cycles had settled into calm routines, the true rhythm of the chinampa life was revealed in what many outsiders would call waiting. Not dramatic waiting, not tense waiting, just slow, gentle observation that filled entire mornings and afternoons with quiet purpose. The primary actors in this chapter are seeds. unassuming, yet utterly essential. Each seed carried an entire life's potential, and the gardener's role was to tend, observe, and anticipate without ever rushing the process. The entire art of the chinampa rested in that quiet, patient patience. The arrival of seeds. Seeds arrived in bundles, carefully sorted and often labeled with soft etchings in mud or tied fibers. The gardener examined them before planting, sometimes rolling them gently between fingers, feeling for firmness, scent, or weight. In that gentle touch was centuries of knowledge: which seed was ready, which seed might fail, and which had the potential to thrive. Unlike modern farming, where machinery dictates schedules, chinampa planting relied on observation. Gardeners watched soil moisture, recent rainfall, subtle shifts in sunlight, wind patterns over the canal. They waited for alignment, not force. Planting wasn't a checklist, it was an interaction. The first planting steps. Once a seed was deemed ready, the gardener made a small indentation in the soft soil, never deeper than necessary. They placed the seed with the precision of handling something delicate, neither dropped nor pushed too forcefully, but settled in gently. A light touch of soil covered it, and a soft pat ensured it made contact without being crushed. Then the gardener stepped back, shifted weight slightly, and continued to the next seed. The rhythm became hypnotic: dig, place, pat, step, glance, repeat. It was slow work, repetitive, unremarkable to anyone who had never observed it. Yet in that repetition lived the promise of growth, the quiet poetry of patience. Soil preparation, gentle architecture. Chinampa soil was layered in a way that required constant maintenance. Sediment dredged from canals was mixed with decomposing organic matter, often leaves, reeds, or composted kitchen scraps. Gardeners distributed it in thin layers, ensuring even coverage. Too much soil could smother seeds. Too little would leave roots exposed. They often used a small, flat wooden paddle to smooth the surface. Each pass across the soil was slow, measured, almost ceremonial. One might imagine it as shaping the foundation of a tiny city, every corner, every edge carefully aligned. And yet, nobody clapped. Nobody announced completion. There was just a finished layer, waiting for the next seed or the next rain. Watering, timing and touch. Watering was another patient exercise. The gardener scooped water from the canal and allowed it to trickle onto the soil in measured amounts. Too much water would wash seeds away. Too little would leave them parched. It wasn't a precise measurement in liters or gallons. It was a feeling, water applied until soil seemed soft but not soggy. Gardeners developed intuition over years. A few drops too many, a handful too few. Their hands learned subtle pressure. Their eyes learned subtle color changes in the soil. Each watering created tiny ripples in the canal, small disturbances that mirrored the gardener's subtle impact on the environment. Nothing dramatic, just consistent influence. Watching growth, a slow observation. After planting, gardeners didn't sit idly. They watched. Not in the impatient sense, but in the careful, attentive sense. They looked for tiny green sprouts breaking through soil cracking or compacting, signs of pests, small imbalances in water distribution. Observation was quiet. Movements were minimal. Sometimes a hand would hover over a plant, brushing lightly, almost to reassure it. Sometimes feet shifted slowly along narrow edges, adjusting position without disturbing the soil. It was less work than ritual, less urgency than worry. Just patience, a gentle commitment to the rhythm of life. Weeding, slow, surgical interventions. When unwanted plants appeared, gardeners removed them slowly. Not pulled aggressively, not uprooted in haste. Each weed was grasped carefully at the base, pulled with a gentle tug, dropped into the water, allowed to drift away. The process created its own movement rhythm. Reach, grasp, tug, release, step, glance, repeat. It might appear monotonous, but there was a meditation in that rhythm. Weeds disappeared quietly. Soil remained intact. The gardener maintained harmony between plants and earth without violence. Seedlings and transplanting. Some plants were started in small reed trays before moving to main beds. When seedlings were ready, gardeners transplanted them slowly. Each root ball was lifted gently, transported in small hands or baskets, and placed precisely where it could thrive. Transplanting followed soft choreography. Lift a line, set, cover, press, step back. The gardener often paused after each planting to observe the seedling from multiple angles, ensuring it faced the correct light, had enough space, and could access the canal water. Even in small, unremarkable actions, the gardens demanded awareness and respect. The gentle art of thinning. As seedlings sprouted, gardeners occasionally had to thin them, removing weaker plants to ensure the stronger ones could survive. This wasn't cruel or hurried. It was measured. They selected plants using soft criteria. Stem strength, leaf size, spacing, orientation toward light. Removal was delicate. Gardeners bent close, lifted the seedling, and placed it in water or composted it gently. Nothing abrupt. Nothing wasted. Everything returned to the cycle, slowly, patiently. The subtle role of companion planting. Gardeners didn't just plant one crop in isolation. They considered relationships between plants. Beans supporting maize with nitrogen. Squash leaves providing shade to soil. Herbs deterring insects from more delicate vegetables. These relationships weren't mapped in diagrams. They were learned by observation, trial, and repetition. Gardeners adjusted plant positions with small movements. A seed here, a sprout there. Nothing rushed. No grand gestures. Just an ongoing dialogue with nature, conducted in quiet, repeated steps. Evening observations. As sun softened toward evening, gardeners walked the chinampas again. Not to plant or harvest, but to check the day's subtle progress. Seedlings were upright. Soil held moisture. Water channels were still open. The movements were slower than morning, more reflective than functional. Hands lingered on leaves. Feet shifted lightly along edges. Eyes followed subtle color changes in soil and plant growth. Conversations were minimal, whispers passing between workers who had shared the day's labor. Evening was the moment when the rhythm of waiting became visible. Patience, repetition, and gentle care, all choreographed across tiny plots of floating earth. Seeds, soil, and the patient art of waiting. Everything in the chinampa depended on it. Nothing hurried, nothing loud, everything steady. And as the day ended, gardeners left their plots knowing that tomorrow they would dance the same rhythm again. Step, bend, water, pat, observe. Slow, quiet, unending. Perfectly suited for life among floating gardens. Chapter 11, Water and Reflection. The serene management of chinampa canals ****. Once the seeds were planted and the soil gently shaped, the next layer of chinampa life revolved around water. Not dramatic floods. Not heroic irrigation feats. Just soft, constant management. Canals were the quiet arteries of the floating gardens, carrying nutrients, supporting canoe travel, and regulating moisture in ways that were almost invisible if you weren't paying close attention. This chapter explores the subtle choreography of water management, the unhurried techniques, the small interventions, and the continuous observation that kept canals functional and gardens alive. The gentle flow of canals. Canals weren't wide or tumultuous. They were usually just wide enough for a small canoe, shallow enough for poles to reach the bottom, and steady in their rhythm. Water moved slowly, carrying sediment and organic matter that enriched the chinampa soil. Gardeners often stood at edges, barefoot, toes in the water, feeling the subtle shifts. A small current might indicate a blockage somewhere upstream. A faint ripple might signal a passing fish disturbing the sediment. Nothing in these observations was urgent. It was simply awareness, tuned by experience and repetition. Poling the canoes. Travel along canals required balance and precision. Gardeners relied on long wooden poles to navigate from one chinampa plot to another. The poles moved with soft, fluid strokes. Press, push, glide, lift, reset. Each motion was measured. The water responded like a patient companion. Sometimes, multiple gardeners shared a single canoe. Their movements synchronized naturally, creating a slow duet, one pole pushing forward, another steadying, a gentle sway of the vessel, and the soft slap of water along wooden edges. There was no rush, only quiet propulsion over and over until the next stop. Adjusting water levels. A significant part of canal management involved small, almost invisible adjustments. Tiny sluices, reed barriers, and shallow channels allowed gardeners to redistribute water gradually. Too much water could drown seedlings. Too little could dry roots. Both scenarios required patience, not panic. Gardeners often waded into the shallows, hands adjusting reeds, fingers brushing sediment, sometimes kneeling or crouching. Movements were careful, gentle lifts, slow replacements, slight tilts. Over hours, small shifts ensured water moved where it needed to go. No sudden plunges. No splashes or shouts. Just subtle, effective guidance. Cleaning the canal bed. Sediment was a constant companion. Left unchecked, it could clog small channels and reduce water flow. Gardeners removed it with long-handled nets or scoops, sliding them along the bottom. The motion was steady. Dip, skip, release, repeat. Sediment formed fertile mud piles at the edges, later used to replenish chinampa soil. This cycle turned water management into soil care, a slow loop of give and take. Even in this physical work, the rhythm remained unhurried. Muscle memory guided the motions, and the water accepted them without complaint. Maintaining canal edges. Edges were reinforced with reeds, mud, and sometimes willow branches. The work resembled miniature engineering projects, rebuilding small walls, patching weak sections, and smoothing surfaces to prevent erosion. Gardeners crouched or knelt, hands pressing mud, weaving reeds into gentle lattices, adjusting tension until the edges were just firm enough to hold water but flexible enough to absorb minor shifts. Each patchwork section reflected a balance between structure and adaptability. And the movements, small lifts, presses, and pulls, became another form of meditation as gardeners merged manual labor with patient observation. The water as teacher. Over time, gardeners learned to read canals. Sediment color revealed soil health. Current patterns indicated upstream conditions. Slight ripples signaled wind or passing wildlife. This wasn't science as we think of it. It was quiet expertise developed over years, embedded in the rhythm of daily work. Observing water became an exercise in attention, patience, and subtle adaptation. Gardeners responded not with force but with small interventions, respecting the canal's natural tendencies while gently guiding it toward productivity. Floating gardens as living ecosystems. Chinampas weren't isolated plots. Each canal, each garden, and each water movement interacted with the next. The gentle push of a canoe here could redirect a current there. A misplaced reed barrier might influence water flow downstream. Gardeners adapted continuously. They moved slowly, assessed constantly, and nudged the ecosystem rather than dominating it. Every step, every pole stroke, every handful of sediment contributed to a larger pattern, a living, breathing network of earth and water maintained by rhythm rather than rush. Reflections on the calm. From the surface, canals mirrored the sky. Trees along the edges leaned softly, shadows stretched across water, and the gardener's movements became faint ripples that spread outward. There was no drama in the scene, just repetition, patience, and subtle influence. This is the quiet genius of chinampa life, productivity through calm, attention without urgency, labor that flows as naturally as water. The gardens, the canals, the tools, the seeds, all part of a single slow, coherent choreography. Observing it makes the mind float. Each motion is predictable yet satisfying. Each day blends seamlessly into the next. Evening calm. As the sun dipped, gardeners returned tools to simple racks, rinsed baskets in shallow canals, and stepped into canoes for the short drift home. Poles rested across shoulders, water lapped softly against hulls, and faint patterns of movement from the day lingered in the surface ripples. Even in departure, nothing rushed. The rhythm of canals, gardens, and hands would continue tomorrow. The flow would resume naturally. And so would the quiet life of the floating G Chapter 12, harvest, and the gentle cycle of the chinampas. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the seeds planted and nurtured on the chinampas eventually reached the slow, quiet stage that gardeners awaited: harvest. Not dramatic or hurried harvesting. Not shouting, flailing, or frantic collection. Just the unhurried, deliberate picking and gathering of plants that had grown patiently under calm hands. In this chapter, we explore the rhythm of harvest, the slow, flowing movements, the careful handling of fragile produce, and the way seasonal change dictated the pace of work. Morning light and readiness. Harvest typically began in the soft hours of early morning, when the sun had warmed the air just enough to make work pleasant, but not so much as to wilt the plants or the gardeners. Mist often lingered above the canals, curling lazily around reeds and vegetable tops. The light filtered through gently, casting long shadows across the narrow garden strips. Gardeners stepped from their canoes with quiet precision, tools in hand, small knives for cutting, baskets for carrying, and mats to lay harvested crops. Each step was measured. The soft earth underfoot welcomed them, yielding slightly but providing enough support to prevent slips. Movements were careful, practiced, almost ritualistic.